Hello everyone, welcome to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, and I also know that this might be your first time coming across our channel. So, before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright now, let's get comfortable, relaxed and dive into tonight's first stories. Tonight we journey into a story that unfolds slowly, like autumn leaves drifting to the ground. A story of ordinary lives in a small Illinois town, where beneath the surface of normalcy, something dark was taking shape. Let the words wash over you as we explore the tragic case of Norman McCaster. It was late October in 2012. The air in central Illinois carried that crisp bite of approaching winter. Deer season had arrived, and hunters were taking to the woods around Springfield, making their way through forests painted in browns and golds. On the 29th day of October, one such hunter was making his way home after a day in the field. He drove along the rural roads near Mechanicsburg, a quiet community where everyone knew their neighbors. As he passed by a creek, something caught his eye near the water's edge. At first glance it looked like a deer carcass, perhaps left behind by another hunter. But something about it didn't sit right with him. The shape seemed wrong somehow. Still, he continued driving home, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. At night, lying in bed, the image kept returning to his mind. By morning he couldn't ignore his instinct any longer. He called the authorities. When Sangamon County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the creek, they found something that would haunt them for years to come. What the hunter had seen was not a deer, it was human remains. But these were not ordinary remains. The body had been dismembered with surgical precision. The head was gone. The hands were missing. The feet had been removed. All that remained was a torso, abandoned in the quiet woods like discarded refuse. Chief Deputy Joe Roche arrived at the scene. In his more than 20 years in law enforcement, he had seen many things. But this was different. The brutality of it, the calculated nature of the dismemberment, spoke of something deeply disturbing. "We do not see this type of crime in Sangamon County," he would later say. The immediate assumption was that this had to be gang-related, drug-related, the work of organized criminals from outside their peaceful community. The coroner began the difficult work of trying to identify the victim. Without a head, without hands, without any identifying features, it seemed like an impossible task. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure this person could never be identified. But they had made one crucial mistake. Near the body, about 30 feet away, investigators found 2 receipts. They were from Walmart. The items purchased included a reciprocating saw, cleaning supplies, and plastic sheeting. The receipts were dated the same day the body was believed to have been dumped. It was a small clue, but it was something, a thread they could pull. While investigators worked to trace those receipts, let me tell you about a young woman named Uatasha Denton. In many ways, she seemed like the embodiment of the American dream. Born in 1988 in Illinois, she had grown up attending church regularly, surrounded by family and friends who knew her as sweet, genuine, and dedicated. In high school, Uatasha excelled. She was an honors student, the kind of young woman teachers pointed to as an example. She had plans, ambitions, a future that stretched bright before her. Her friends described her as someone who never failed at anything. Failure simply wasn't in her vocabulary. At school, she met a boy named Norman Raymel McCaster. Norman was born on June 18, 1990, and those who knew him described him as a wonderful young man with a kind heart. He and Uatasha were high school sweethearts, the kind of couple that made people smile. young love blooming in the halls of an Illinois high school. Norman joined the Army National Guard, serving his community and country with pride. His father, Marcel, was incredibly close to him. They had the kind of relationship where they spoke nearly every day, where Norman would never make a decision without talking it through with his dad first. Jatasha and Norman's relationship grew serious. They decided to get married, standing before their families and promising to love each other through whatever came. Jatasha was 22 years old. Norman was also 22. They moved to Springfield together, starting their new life as husband and wife. Jatasha enrolled at the University of Illinois Springfield, continuing her education while Norman served in the National Guard. To their neighbors, to their community, they seemed like any other young couple navigating the early years of marriage. They attended church, they went about their daily routines. Nothing seemed amiss, but beneath this surface of normalcy something was shifting. Back at the crime scene, investigators were making progress. The Walmart receipts they'd found were traced to a credit card. When they ran the name on that card, they found themselves staring at something unexpected. The card belonged to Jatasha Denton McCaster, a college student, a church-going young woman with no criminal history, someone who had recently moved to the area with her husband. It seemed impossible that someone like her could be connected to such a brutal crime. Investigators decided to look deeper. They discovered that Jatasha's husband, Norman McCaster, had recently missed a mandatory National Guard drill. For someone as dedicated as Norman, someone who took his service seriously, this was highly unusual. They tried to contact him, but there was no response. Detectives decided to pay Jatasha a visit. When they knocked on her door, she greeted them with a smile. She invited us into her house, was very genuine, sweet, asking us if we wanted something to drink, Sergeant Vos would later recall. They sat on her couch, and she seemed completely at ease. When they asked about Norman, Jatasha explained that he had left. She told them that their marriage had been struggling because of Norman's drug addiction. She said he had gone off with some people from St. Louis, drug users who had come to take him away. She didn't know what kind of car they drove. When asked what Norman had taken with him, she said simply, just the clothes on his back. She hadn't reported him missing. She hadn't called his family. She hadn't seemed worried at all. The detectives left her house, but something felt wrong. They decided to speak with Norman's father, Marcel. When they told him that Norman had supposedly run off with drug users, Marcel's reaction was immediate and certain. You must not know my son and the relationship me and him have, he told them. He's not going to run off without telling me or calling me. Marcel insisted his son didn't use drugs. The picture Jatasha had painted didn't match the Norman that his family knew. The detectives' suspicions deepened. They obtained a DNA sample from the National Guard and compared it to the remains found in the woods. The results came back as a match. The torso found by that hunter, dismembered and discarded, belonged to 22-year-old Norman Raymond McCaster, Jatasha's husband. When Marcel received the call confirming his son's death, he later said it tore him. At first, investigators wouldn't tell him the manner of death, but when he arrived at the police station and they revealed what had been done to Norman, how his body had been cut apart and scattered, Marcel felt a rage he'd never known before. He wanted to hurt whoever had done this to his son. Even though all signs pointed to Jatasha, investigators found it hard to believe. How could this petite, meek, mild-mannered woman with no criminal history have committed such a heinous crime? State's Attorney John Milheiser voiced what everyone was thinking. How could this young church-going woman have done this? But they couldn't ignore the evidence. They placed Jatasha under 24-hour surveillance. They watched as she went about her normal life, shopping, going to class, seemingly unbothered by her husband's disappearance. One day they watched as she took her trash to the curb. The moment it hit the curb, it became public property. Investigators moved in and seized the garbage bags. What they found inside was chilling. First, there were floor tiles. Why would someone throw away floor tiles from their bathroom? It seemed odd, suspicious. The tiles were sent to a crime lab, where they would test positive for blood. Then there were bottles, multiple bottles of Visine eye drops. Investigators were puzzled at first. Why would someone have so many bottles of eye drops in their trash? But then they learned something disturbing. The active ingredient in Visine, tetrahydrozoline, can be fatal if ingested in large quantities. It was a poison that could kill, and it was difficult to detect. But the most damning discovery came in another bag. This one wasn't filled with garbage at all. It was filled with men's clothing, soldiers' uniforms, the unmistakable fatigues of the National Guard. As investigators sorted through the clothing, they found an identification card. It belonged to Norman McCaster. Joatasha had thrown away her husband's entire wardrobe, his uniforms, everything that proved he had ever lived in that house with her. She was erasing him, piece by piece. With enough evidence to justify search warrants, investigators obtained permission to search Joatasha's home and seize her laptop computer. What the forensic examination revealed was a window into premeditation, into months of planning. The computer searches had started around the beginning of June, months before Norman's death. The search history read like a manual for murder. How to kill your husband. How to kill a spouse and get away with it. Ways to kill someone and not get caught. Poison tasteless but deadly. How much Visine does it take to kill? The searches went on and on. A chronicle of someone methodically researching how to end another person's life. These weren't impulsive searches made in a moment of anger. They were calculated, repeated over weeks and months. Someone was planning, learning, preparing. In Joatasha's house, investigators found more evidence. There was a handwritten list on a piece of paper. It read, "Register gun and bleach walls." They discovered that tiles had been removed from the bathroom floor. When they examined the area beneath, chemical tests reacted positively to blood. Someone had tried to clean up a crime scene. There was also something odd that detectives had noticed during their first visit. On the kitchen wall hung a calendar. Their 2-year wedding anniversary, October 26th, had been completely blacked out. Someone had taken a marker and obliterated the date. Their 2-year anniversary was coming up and Norman McCaster was not going to make that 2-year anniversary. State's Attorney Milheiser would explain, and she was going to make sure of it. As the investigation continued, detectives learned about a crucial piece of evidence. A fellow student at the University of Illinois Springfield came forward with a disturbing story. Joatasha had approached him and asked to borrow a gun. He had loaned it to her, not thinking much of it at the time. A day later she returned it, but when he checked the weapon, he noticed something. 2 bullets were missing. Prosecutors believed those 2 bullets had been fired into Norman's head. That's why his head had to be removed with the reciprocating saw. The evidence of gunshot wounds would have been too obvious, too easily traced back to the borrowed weapon. The theory that emerged was methodical and chilling. Joatasha had likely attempted to poison Norman first, using the Visine. Toxicology reports would later confirm that Norman had elevated levels of tetrahydrozoline in his liver, but perhaps the poison hadn't worked quickly enough, or perhaps Norman had realized something was wrong, so she had used the gun, and then, in the bathroom of their home, she had used the reciprocating saw to dismember his body. Norman weighed over 200 pounds. In order to move him, to transport him, she had to cut him into smaller pieces. Or perhaps, as prosecutors theorized, she was trying to make identification impossible by removing his head, hands, and feet, anything that could be used to identify him through dental records or fingerprints. Investigators believed she had used a dolly to move the torso. Surveillance footage from various stores showed her purchasing all the supplies she would need. The saw, plastic sheeting, cleaning supplies, everything required for the grisly task ahead. Armed with overwhelming evidence, detectives brought Shutasha in for questioning. They showed her the search warrants for her home, and for a sample of her DNA. They made it clear this was a homicide investigation. Yatasha seemed almost confused. Am I under arrest or something?" she asked. "Yup," the detective replied. "You're under arrest for the concealment of a homicide." On November 26, 2012, Joatasha Denton McCaster was formally charged with first-degree murder, dismembering a body, concealing a homicidal death, and obstructing justice. She was held on a $5 million bond. The community was in shock. This quiet, church-going student, this young woman who seemed to have everything going for her, was accused of murdering and dismembering her own husband. It didn't fit any profile, any expectation, but the evidence was undeniable. The trial began in early 2014. For days, the prosecution laid out their case, piece by damning piece. They presented the Walmart receipts that had been found near Norman's body. Store surveillance footage showed Shutasha purchasing the reciprocating saw. On the same day Norman was believed to have been killed. They presented evidence from the trash, the soldiers' uniforms, the floor tiles with traces of blood, the bottles of Visine that suggested an attempted poisoning. They showed the jury Joatasha's computer search history, that months-long digital trail of someone researching murder. They called the fellow student who had loaned Joatasha the gun, who testified that it came back missing 2 bullets. They presented testimony from the forensic toxicologist, who had found elevated levels of tetrahydrozoline in Norman's liver. Dr. Scott Denton, the pathologist who had performed the autopsy, testified that he couldn't determine the exact cause of death because he only had the torso to examine. Without the head, without being able to see if there were gunshot wounds or trauma to the skull, the precise moment of Norman's death remained uncertain. But the evidence of foul play was overwhelming. Throughout the trial, Joatasha maintained her innocence. She tried to use her faith, her church involvement, her clean record as a defense, but as many observers noted, going to church doesn't automatically make someone a good person. Actions speak louder than appearances. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the blood tests weren't definitive, that there were other possible explanations, but the mountain of evidence was too high to climb. After more than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict on April 1, 2014. Guilty, guilty, on all counts. First-degree murder, dismemberment of a human body, concealment of a homicidal death, obstruction of justice. On June 25, 2014, Joatasha Denton McCaster stood before Judge Peter Kavanaugh for sentencing. The judge noted something significant. Even after being convicted, she had not shown remorse or accepted responsibility for what she had done. The judge sentenced her to 78 years in prison, 55 years for first-degree murder, 20 years for dismemberment, 3 years for concealment of a homicidal death. The sentences would run consecutively, meaning she would have to serve them one after another. State's Attorney John Milhiser addressed the court. This was a planned execution of her husband. She planned it for months and months. She was convicted and sentenced. It was just a brutal crime. Norman's family was in the courtroom. His mother, Frederskia Morsby, spoke about finally having closure, though the pain would never truly leave. I'm happy, she said through tears. It just hurts." Marcel, Norman's father, struggled to articulate the depth of his loss. He revealed that he mourned his son in private, not wanting to burden the rest of the family with his grief. "Every morning I go out to the car," he said. "I'll sit there and I'll cry. because that's how much I miss him. He meant a lot to me. Juatasha appealed her sentence, arguing that 78 years was excessive, given her lack of prior criminal history. But the appellate court upheld the sentence in 2017. The brutality of the crime, the months of planning, the complete lack of remorse, all of it justified the lengthy sentence. To this day, Norman's head, hands, and feet have never been recovered. Investigators believe Juatasha disposed of them in a body of water somewhere, possibly during a trip to Chicago. Those parts of Norman, the pieces that would have made identifying him easier, remain lost. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you wonder, as many have wondered, what drives someone to such an act? What makes a person who once promised to love and cherish someone, then plan their methodical destruction? Investigators believe that Juatasha had grown discontent with her marriage. Perhaps it wasn't living up to the perfect image she had in her mind. Remember, she was someone for whom failure was not an option, someone who always succeeded at everything she tried. When her marriage began to crumble, when that perfect life she had envisioned started to crack, something in her snapped. Instead of pursuing a divorce, instead of seeking counseling or simply walking away, she made a different choice. She chose to eliminate the problem entirely. For months, she researched and planned. She gathered supplies. She borrowed a gun. She made her preparations with the cold precision of someone approaching a task to be completed. Some have theorized that there were issues of control, of a perfectionist unable to accept that something in her life wasn't going according to plan. Others have suggested that perhaps there were financial considerations, or secrets that haven't come to light. The truth, known fully only to Juatasha herself, remains locked behind prison walls. Norman's family remembers him not as a victim, not as a crime statistic, but as the loving son, the dedicated soldier, the young man with his whole life ahead of him. They remember his smile, his dedication to his family, the way he would never make a decision without calling his father first. They remember the Norman who existed before October 26, 2012, before his 2-year anniversary that he would never reach. As of today, Juatasha Denton McCaster remains incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Illinois. She will be in her 90s before she becomes eligible for release. There are no public records of her participating in rehabilitation programs or showing any remorse for her actions. The case sent shockwaves through the community of Springfield and Mechanicsburg. It prompted discussions about domestic violence, about the hidden troubles that can lurk behind closed doors, about the importance of recognizing warning signs. It reminded investigators that evil doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it wears the face of a college student, a churchgoer, someone with no criminal history and every advantage in life. The hunter who found Norman's remains that October day went back to his life, but the image of what he saw by that creek surely haunts him still. The detectives who worked the case, who sifted through trash and pieced together the puzzle, carry with them the memory of one of the most brutal crimes their county had ever seen. And Marcel Banks sits in his car some mornings and cries for his son, for all the conversations they'll never have, for all the moments that were stolen when someone decided that Norman McCaster's life was expendable. So if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Midnight Crime Stories, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we'll walk together through the events surrounding Molly Watson, a woman who dreamed of her fairy tale wedding, only to have those dreams end on a dark country road just 48 hours before she was meant to say "I do." Let your breathing slow. This is a story of love and lies, of secrets carefully kept and truths that couldn't stay hidden forever. Our story begins in Moberly, Missouri, a small town where everyone knows everyone, where life moves at the gentle pace of the seasons. On December 15th, 1982, Timothy and Sandra Watson welcomed their daughter into the world. They named her Molly Nicole Watson. From the beginning, Molly was different in all the best ways. She was intelligent, creative, a girl who saw the world through a unique lens. She excelled in school, absorbing knowledge like sunlight. As she grew, her passions bloomed. She loved to sing, her voice carrying through the rooms of her childhood home. She loved creating costumes, elaborate and colorful, stitching together fabrics in imagination, and she loved documenting her life, recording video diaries on YouTube where she shared her thoughts, her dreams, her authentic self with anyone who cared to listen. Molly struggled with Asperger's syndrome, but she was highly functioning and never let it define her. Instead, it was simply part of who she was, part of what made her see the world a little differently, a little more intensely. She had a son, Declan, whom she adored. He was her world, the center of her universe, and she made sure he knew it every single day. After a first marriage ended in divorce, Molly found herself in a relationship with Amber Brady, a childhood friend. For about 5 years they shared their lives together. They understood each other, communicated well, enjoyed the same things. It simply clicked. But like many relationships, this one eventually ran its course, ending in a way that left both women moving forward separately. And then, Molly's life took a new turn. She got a job at the Moberly Area Correctional Center, working as a corrections officer. It was 2011. She was 28 years old, and it was there, behind those walls, that she met James Addy. James Addy was 51 years old when Molly met him. He wore the uniform of a corrections officer with authority, having worked his way up through the ranks to become a lieutenant. To look at him, you might see a man of responsibility, a man of order. He had been married 4 times before. 4 times he had stood at an altar and made promises. 4 times those promises had eventually broken. But when Molly looked at him, she saw something else. She saw a man she could love, a man she could trust, a man who told her he was going through a divorce that would be finalized soon. Just a matter of paperwork, he said. Just a matter of time. Molly's brother Tim would later say she was absolutely 100% in love with Addie. And indeed, she was. For 7 years their relationship continued. 7 years of phone calls and secret meetings. 7 years of Molly believing that soon, they would be able to be together openly, to build a life without having to hide. Addie had a way about him that made Molly look past certain things. Her family noticed it though. Tim Watson, Molly's brother, felt uneasy around James from the start. There was something evasive about him, something that didn't quite sit right. He could never look you in the eye when he spoke. His answers were always indirect, dancing around direct questions. He put off what Tim called bad vibes to everybody. Some family members became so uncomfortable with James that they told Molly they wouldn't even attend the wedding. But Molly saw past all of that. Love has a way of softening the edges of our doubts, of painting over the warning signs with brighter colors. She believed in the future James promised her. What Molly didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that James Addy was living 2 completely separate lives. Every night he went home to a house in Santa Fe, Missouri. Not a large house, just a simple 3-bedroom home in the rural countryside. And in that house lived his wife Melanie Addy, his wife of 23 years, his wife who had no idea that her husband was engaged to another woman. Melanie would later describe their marriage as normal. Sometimes good, sometimes challenging, but normal. James came home every night. He was there for dinner. He helped around the house. He absolutely hated people who had affairs, she said, so she never would have thought him capable of having one. They had 2 children together, Ben and Emma. Emma was still living at home, a bright young woman attending Paris High School. She knew her father as any daughter would, flawed perhaps, but hers. She had no idea about Molly Watson, no idea that her father was planning a wedding while still sleeping in the same house, same bed with her mother. The lies James Addy told were intricate, layered, maintained with careful precision. To Molly he spun tales of a divorce that kept getting delayed. To Melanie, he never mentioned Molly at all. When he traveled to Mexico or Florida with Molly, vacations where they smiled for photos, arms wrapped around each other. He told Melanie it was work training. He even provided her with official-looking letters from the prison explaining his absences. Sniper training in Florida, he said, prison work in Mexico. And Melanie believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was her husband, the father of her children, the man who came home every single night. In 2018, after 7 years together, James Addy finally proposed to Molly Watson. She said yes without hesitation. Her dreams were finally coming true. Molly threw herself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. She envisioned a beautiful ceremony at the Stony Creek Hotel and Conference Center in Columbia, Missouri. The date was set, April 29, 2018. The theme would be Renaissance-inspired, with touches of Disney magic, because Molly still believed in fairy tales. The colors would be burgundy and gold. There would be flowers and candles and music. She bought not 1 but 2 wedding dresses, because she simply couldn't decide which one made her feel more like a bride. She tried them on, twirling in front of mirrors, recording videos of herself, documenting every moment of this journey toward her happily ever after. Sam Cohen, the wedding planner, worked with Molly on every detail. From Molly's perspective, it was going to be a beautiful wedding and the best day ever. The excitement in Molly's voice was unmistakable. This was what she had been waiting for. But as the wedding day approached, something changed. A few weeks before the ceremony, Molly contacted the wedding planner with unfortunate news. They needed to reduce the guest list. James had told her something tragic. His ex-wife Melanie had been in a terrible car accident during Christmas, 4 months earlier. She'd been on life support ever since, and now, just weeks before the wedding, James and his children had made the impossible decision to let her go. Melanie had died, he told Molly. The family was grieving. They couldn't invite as many people to the wedding now. It wouldn't be appropriate. Molly believed him. She sent the wedding planner an email, explaining the situation, her heart breaking for the man she loved, and the loss his family was experiencing. She made the adjustments. She understood. Of course, Melanie Addy had never been in any car accident. She was alive and well, living in the same house with James, sleeping beside him every night, completely unaware that her husband was telling people she was dead. On April 25, 2018, 48 hours before the wedding, James Addy and Molly Watson walked into the Randolph County Recorder of Deeds office to obtain their marriage license. Mark Price, the Recorder of Deeds, prepared their paperwork. He would later recall that Molly seemed pleasant, excited. James, on the other hand, seemed perturbed by some of the questions he was asked. There was an edge to him, a tension. The marriage license was issued. In 2 days they would be husband and wife. Except James Addy was already a husband. Already married. The marriage license in Molly's hand was meaningless. Illegal, actually. If they went through with the ceremony, it would be bigamy. But Molly didn't know that. Friday night, April 27th, 2018, just one day before the wedding. At the Addy home in Santa Fe, the evening began like any other. Melanie got off work, and she and James went out to dinner in Mexico, Missouri. They came home. It was an ordinary night. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, James left the house. He was wearing a black jacket, blue jeans, and boots. He told Melanie he was going to visit a friend. Emma, their daughter, was home that evening, working on an online class assignment. She was a junior at Paris High School, focused on her studies, unaware that her world was about to shatter. Meanwhile, in Huntsville, Missouri, Molly Watson was at home. Her phone rang. It was James. They talked as she got into her car. The phone records would later show that they stayed on the call as she drove, as she navigated the dark country roads leading out of town. They were still on the phone as she turned onto Road M, as she crossed Highway 151, as she drove toward a remote area near Middle Grove, a place where a creek crossed the road, where the trees grew thick and the darkness was absolute. This was their plan, it seemed, to meet here, in this isolated place. Perhaps James told her he wanted to see her before the wedding. Perhaps he said he had a gift for her, or that he needed to tell her something important. We don't know what words passed between them during that drive. We only know that Molly trusted him completely. She was driving to meet the man she would marry in just over 24 hours. The area where she stopped was desolate, a low-water creek crossing, the kind of place you'd only know about if you lived locally. The kind of place where if you wanted to be alone, you could be completely, utterly alone. Molly got out of her car. Her marriage license was on the passenger seat. And then in the darkness of that rural Missouri road, James Addy pulled out a gun, a .22 caliber weapon. He positioned himself behind Molly Watson, the woman who loved him, the woman who had bought 2 wedding dresses and planned a ceremony with burgundy and gold decorations, and who had waited 7 years for this moment. He pressed the gun against the back of her head, and he fired. The single bullet entered Molly's skull at point-blank range, lodging deep in her brain. She had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. She collapsed immediately. The life that had been so full of singing and creating and dreaming ended in an instant on that dark road. James Addy then dragged her body, positioning it in the road in front of her car. In the process, her clothing was pulled, leaving her partially unclothed. He left her there, in the dirt and the darkness. And then he went home. Glenn McSparron was taking a shortcut that Friday night. He was driving home from his mother's house, navigating the rural roads he knew well. It was around 10 o'clock in the evening. As his headlights swept across the road ahead, he saw something unusual. A car pulled off to the side, near the creek crossing. And then as he got closer, his headlights illuminated something that made his heart stop. A body, a woman, lying in the road. When I saw her, I swear my heart stopped. I could tell she wasn't moving. McSparron would later recall. He immediately called 911. The operator instructed him to check for a pulse, but Glenn already knew. I looked in her eyes, and I could tell that she was gone. But here's something crucial. About 30 minutes before Glenn McSparron discovered Molly's body, he had driven past this same spot, and he had seen someone, a man, standing by the road. The man seemed to be acting strangely, suspiciously. McSparron drove on, thinking little of it at the time. Only later would he realize what he had witnessed. When the Monroe County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene, they found Molly Watson, 35 years old, one day before her wedding. She was still wearing her engagement ring. This was not a robbery. In her car they found the marriage license. The groom's name James Addy. Address, Santa Fe, Missouri. The officers knew what they had to do. Someone had to notify the groom that his bride-to-be had been killed. It was around 2:20 in the morning when Missouri Highway Patrol Master Sergeant Bradley Ream drove to the address listed on the marriage license. He knocked on the door of the Addy home. James Addy answered. Sergeant Ream began to explain about Molly Watson, about the tragedy that had occurred, and then from a side room, a woman appeared. I asked who she was, and she said, "I am his wife," and he said she was his wife. Ream later testified. The officer was stunned. The groom was already married, had been married for 23 years, to be exact. Melanie Addy stood there in her own home, learning for the first time that her husband had been in a 7-year relationship with another woman, that he had planned to marry this woman the next day, that this woman was now dead. The investigation began immediately. James Addy told investigators that on the evening of April 27th, he had gone to visit a friend, but the friend wasn't home, so he had driven around for a while, before returning home. He said he got home around 8:30 in the evening, but Emma, his daughter, told a different story. She said her father didn't come home until around 10 o'clock, significantly later than he claimed. She was in the bathroom brushing her teeth when he arrived. He came and stood in the doorway in his underwear, then walked out to the dining room to get food from the microwave. He looked antsy, she said. She noticed he was doing laundry, and there was a strong smell bleach. After James was taken to the police station for questioning, Melanie began searching their home. She needed to understand what had happened, what her husband had been hiding. In the garage she found nothing, but when she climbed up to the attic, she discovered boxes. Molly's boxes. Boxes that Molly had been slowly moving into what she thought would become her marital home. Inside were photo albums. Page after page of pictures. James and Molly in Mexico, smiling in the sun. James and Molly in Florida, arms around each other. 7 years of photographs documenting a relationship that Melanie never knew existed. 7 years of vacations she thought her husband had taken for work. The investigators worked quickly, methodically. They collected evidence from the crime scene. They found tire impressions in the dirt near where Molly's body lay. When they examined James Addy's vehicle, the tires matched, not conclusively. The expert would later testify he couldn't be 100% certain, but they were consistent. They found a t-shirt in a field near the crime scene. It was covered in blood, Molly's blood. The shirt was unusual, distinctive. When shown a photo of it, Emma Addy recognized it immediately. She had made it herself for a class project and given it to her father. They searched James Addy's home and found ammunition, 22 caliber rounds, the same caliber as the bullet lodged in Molly Watson's skull. An empty ammunition box found near the crime scene was consistent with the brand found in Addy's home. A gun was found in plain sight in his house, a 22 caliber weapon. However, no DNA evidence linked the gun directly to Molly, and no gunpowder residue was found on it. This would be a weakness in the prosecution's case. They discovered that James had a secret phone, a second phone he used exclusively to communicate with Molly. The phone records showed the calls between them on the night of April 27th, tracking Molly's journey from her home to the place where she died. And then there was the search history on Molly's phone. The day before she was killed, Molly had searched for something specific. Melanie Addy's obituary. Had she finally begun to suspect? Had doubts crept in about the story James had told her? We'll never know. But she had searched for proof that the woman James claimed was dead had actually died. She found nothing, of course, because Melanie Addy was alive. On April 28, 2018, less than 24 hours after Molly's body was discovered, James Addy was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. In the days that followed, Molly's family prepared for a funeral instead of a wedding. The venue that should have been filled with joy and celebration instead held grief and disbelief. Molly's brother, Tim, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Their parents, Timothy and Sandra Watson, were shattered. Molly's son, Declan, had lost his mother. The woman who had loved him more than anything in the world was gone. Melanie Addy filed for divorce. After 23 years of marriage, she learned that the man she shared her life with was a stranger. She later told the press that James was a pretty selfish person. He could be controlling and intimidating. It could be challenging. When asked if she thought he was capable of murder, she said it seemed like something he would do to fix a problem. Emma Addy, their daughter, never spoke to her father again after his arrest. The man she had known her entire life had killed someone, had been living a lie, had destroyed not just one family but two. The case took 3 years to come to trial. 3 years of delays, of venue changes, of a pandemic that slowed the wheels of justice. Finally, in April 2021, 3 years to the month after Molly's death, James Addy sat in a Cole County courtroom to face a jury of his peers. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, piece by piece constructing a picture of guilt. They presented the phone records showing James and Molly on the phone as she drove to her death. They showed the tire impressions from the crime scene that were consistent with James's vehicle. They brought forward the bloody t-shirt, with Emma's tearful testimony that she had made it for her father. They displayed the ammunition found in James's home, connecting it to the bullet that killed Molly. They called Melanie to the stand. She testified about the night of the murder, about James leaving around 7 and returning home late. She testified about finding the photo albums in the attic, about the 7 years of lies. Emma testified too, with her father watching, tears in his eyes. She told the jury about the night he came home late, about the smell of bleach, about his anxious demeanor. It was a moment of profound tragedy, a daughter testifying against her father in a murder trial. 2 inmates who had been in jail with James while he awaited trial testified that they had asked him about his high bail. According to their testimony, James allegedly responded that he had put someone face down in a ditch. The defense would argue these inmates couldn't be trusted, that they had reasons to lie. The wedding planner testified about Molly's excitement, about the email regarding James's supposedly deceased wife, about a bride who was planning what she believed would be the best day of her life. Glenn McSparran testified about finding Molly's body, about seeing a man acting suspiciously in the same location 30 minutes earlier. However, he couldn't positively identify that man as James Addy, a significant weakness in the prosecution's case. The medical examiner explained that Molly died from a contact gunshot wound to the back of the head, meaning the gun was pressed directly against her skull when it was fired. The defense argued that the state's case was built on assumptions, that James had an affair, yes, but an affair doesn't make someone a murderer. They pointed out the lack of DNA evidence linking James to the gun found in his home. They highlighted that the tire expert couldn't definitively say the impressions matched James's car. They questioned the credibility of the jailhouse informants. Defense attorney T.J. Kirsch repeatedly asked the jury, "Where's the evidence? Where's the proof beyond a reasonable doubt?" But the prosecution had an answer to that question. In closing arguments, they painted a picture of a coward, a man who had lied to 2 women for 7 years, who had created an elaborate web of deceit, and who, when that web was about to collapse, chose murder over truth. The prosecutor said, the defendant was a coward when Molly was alive, and he couldn't tell her the truth, and he was the coward when he couldn't look her in the eye when he killed her. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. On April 29, 2021, 3 years to the day when Molly and James should have been celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, the verdict was read: guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of armed criminal action. James Addy looked down as the verdict was announced. His daughter Emma was not in the courtroom. Melanie was not there either. The family he had once had was gone. Before sentencing, Molly's family was given the opportunity to speak. Tim Watson, Molly's brother, stood before the court. Molly was my best friend, my sister that I'll never see again, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This monster took from not only I, but all the family and friends who loved her. He explained that the tragedy hadn't ended with Molly's death. The stress and heartache had taken a profound toll on their parents. Their father, Timothy Watson Sr., had died of a heart attack in September 2020. Their mother, Sandra, had died just months after that. I feel like James Addy took my entire family away from me, Tim said. Then someone read a statement from Molly's son, Declan. In it, he described his mother as the most important person in his life. Amazing, smart, beautiful, though not perfect. No one is perfect, he wrote. But she made one wrong decision, believing in and trusting you. The statement continued, she was more important to me than you can ever imagine, and I was more important to her than you ever were. So, in a way, you took something from both of us. You took away my mom from me, and you took away her son from her. The jury recommended 20 years for the armed criminal action charge. For the first-degree murder conviction, the judge would decide the sentence. On July 12, 2021, James Addy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 10 additional years. Before being led away, James Addy asked to make a statement. He stood and read aloud a love letter he had written to Molly. He professed his love for her, said how much he missed her, how he wished things had been different. He maintained his innocence, insisted he hadn't killed her, and asked for a new trial, claiming his defense attorney had been ineffective. The judge denied the request. Monroe County Prosecuting Attorney Tally Smith issued a statement. Justice has been served today. James Addy will never be released from prison in the state of Missouri. His actions destroyed two families, the family of his victim, Molly Watson, and his own. James Addy currently sits in a Missouri prison, serving his life sentence. He has filed appeals, still maintaining his innocence, but he remains behind bars, and there he will stay. Molly Nicole Watson was 35 years old when she died. She left behind a son who loved her, a brother who considered her his best friend, parents who cherished her, and friends who knew her as someone creative, unique, and full of life. She was someone who sang, who made costumes, who documented her life in video diaries because she wanted to share herself with the world. She was someone who had been in love before, who had experienced heartbreak, and who had allowed herself to be vulnerable enough to love again. Her obituary stated simply, Molly loved her son, and spending time with family. She will be greatly missed. The wedding that never happened would have been filled with burgundy and gold. There would have been music and laughter. Molly would have worn one of her two dresses, finally having made her choice. She would have walked down an aisle toward a future she had dreamed about for 7 years. Instead, that future ended on a dark road in Middle Grove, Missouri, 48 hours before the wedding, killed by the very man she was supposed to marry. The case of Molly Watson reminds us of several truths. That trust is a precious thing, easily broken. That secrets, when kept long enough, become poison. That love, real love, never asks you to hide or to live half a life in shadows. And that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we don't know at all. As we come to the end of this story, let your mind settle. Let the details drift away like autumn leaves on water. Molly's story is tragic, yes, but she lived, she loved, she created. She left behind a son and a brother who carry her memory. And James Addy, the man who took her life to preserve his lies, will spend the rest of his days behind bars. His double life collapsed into a single truth. He is a murderer, and justice, however imperfect, was served. Please, if you're still with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me the time in your corner of the world, or just say something to show you're still awake. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy these midnight stories. Alright, let's continue with our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a story that reminds us how precious our loved ones are, and how quickly life can change. This is a story about a family, a quiet summer day, and a tragedy that would shake an entire nation. Let yourself drift as we unfold this tale, slowly, carefully, with the respect it deserves. This is the story of the Hunt family murders. Picture Bushey, a peaceful town in Hertfordshire, England. It sits just northwest of London, nestled in rolling countryside, with a population of around 28,000 people. Bushey has the feeling of a village, even though it technically became a town long ago. The streets are lined with homes built over generations. Victorian cottages sit beside 1930s detached houses. Gardens bloom in the summer. Children walk to well-regarded schools. Bushey is the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where the annual festival each July brings the community together, where residents shop at independent stores along the high street, grab coffee at local cafes, and feel genuinely safe. The town has a conservation area near St. James Church, with buildings dating back to the 18th century. History lives here, quietly, without fanfare. On Ashland Close, in a residential neighborhood, stood a detached house valued at around £800,000. Not a mansion, but comfortable. The kind of home a successful professional might call their own. Inside this house lived the Hunt family. John Hunt was the patriarch. A beloved BBC racing commentator, his voice was familiar to millions who listened to horse racing on Radio 5 Live and Sky Sports. He'd been with the BBC since 2004, describing races with precision and passion. His colleagues called him kind, thoughtful, a mentor. But John was happiest, they said, talking about his Carol and his girls. Carol Hunt was 61 years old, a wife, a mother, the heart of her household. And there were the daughters. Hannah, 28, worked as a beautician, bringing confidence to her clients. Louise, 25, ran a dog grooming business from an outbuilding on the family property. She loved animals, loved caring for them. And there was Amy, the oldest daughter, who would survive what was coming. This was a close family. John adored them. They were by all accounts ordinary people living good lives. But someone else knew this family. Someone who had been welcomed into their home. His name was Kyle Marcus Clifford, born on the 5th of April 1998 in Enfield, North London. He was 26 years old in the summer of 2024. Clifford had tried to make something of himself. In 2019, at age 21, he joined the British Army. He became a trooper in the Queen's Dragoon Guards, a reconnaissance regiment with a history stretching back to 1685. The Dragoon Guards were specialists, the eyes and ears of the battlefield. It was prestigious work, but Clifford struggled. Former colleagues would later describe him as immature for his age. He had, they said, a chip on his shoulder. He found it difficult to grasp basic military concepts, though he managed to pass training. After serving briefly, he dropped out in 2022. After the military, Clifford worked as a security guard at a fire and security installation company called Amthal. He was employed there from February through July of 2023. Then he left that job too. By July 2024, he was unemployed, at loose ends. There was darkness in his family history. Clifford's older brother, Bradley, was serving 23 years in prison for murder. In 2017, Bradley had gotten into a confrontation outside a bar in Enfield when a bottle was thrown at his prized red Ford Mustang, damaging the wing mirror. Bradley pursued a moped carrying two young men. He ran them down deliberately, then leapt from his car and beat 18-year-old Soban Khan to death as the boy lay dying in the road. The attack was relentless, vicious. Bradley Clifford was sentenced in 2008. Kyle Clifford knew what his brother had done. Violence ran in the family. For 18 months, Kyle Clifford was Louise Hunt's boyfriend. He was a regular presence in the Hunt household, visiting often. John Hunt would later say he never once heard raised voices between Kyle and Louise. There were no obvious warning signs, no alarms that anything was wrong. Kyle seemed on the surface like an ordinary young man. But behind closed doors, the relationship was different. Friends would later describe Clifford as controlling. He monitored Louise's life, her choices, her friendships. He didn't want her wearing makeup. He didn't want her talking to other men. He mocked her, ridiculed her. The relationship was turbulent. Louise grew tired of it. By June of 2024, she'd had enough of his views, his behavior, his need to control her. On the 26th of June, Louise ended the relationship. To her relief, Clifford appeared to accept it. He seemed calm about the breakup, but acceptance was a mask. Behind it, something was building. In the days following the breakup, Kyle Clifford went shopping. The purchases were methodical, deliberate. He ordered a 10-inch steel butcher's knife. He purchased a Horizon Cornet MXT405 compound crossbow, along with 6 bolts. He tried to order a CO2 Glock air pistol, though it wouldn't arrive in time. He bought large quantities of petrol, duct tape, rope. Digital evidence would later show his internet searches during this period. Clifford was planning something. He was gathering the tools he would need. On the 9th of July, 2024, he put his plan into motion. It was a Tuesday, summer and bushy. The weather was pleasant. John Hunt was working that day, commentating at Lingfield Park Racecourse. Amy was away. Only Carol, Hannah, and Louise were home. Clifford drove to the area in the early afternoon. He parked his car nearby, a black seat, and walked to check the driveway of the Hunt home. He wanted to know whose vehicles were there. He needed to confirm John Hunt was gone. To be certain, Clifford searched online for horse racing events. He looked up John Hunt's schedule, verifying where the commentator would be. Satisfied that John wasn't home, Clifford prepared himself. He concealed the butcher's knife in a rucksack. At 2:32 in the afternoon, he approached the house and rang the doorbell. Carol Hunt answered the door. Clifford told her he was returning some of Louise's belongings. It was a plausible excuse. Carol, always kind, let him in. The doorbell camera captured their conversation on the doorstep. It would also record sounds from inside the house throughout what followed. Once inside, Clifford attacked Carol with the knife. He stabbed her. Carol, 61 years old, who had shown Clifford nothing but kindness, died from those wounds. Based on the timeline, investigators believe Clifford waited. He waited for Carol to die before leaving the house at 3:07 in the afternoon. He walked back to his car, retrieved the crossbow, and concealed it under a blanket. Then he returned to the house. Louise was working in her dog grooming business, located in an outbuilding at the back of the property. Customers came and went through a side gate during the afternoon. Everything seemed normal. At 4:11 in the afternoon, Louise entered the main house. Shortly after, her screams filled the air. High-pitched screaming, a male voice shouting, banging noises. Neighbors would later remember these sounds. The terror lasted until 4:26. Clifford restrained Louise. He bound her wrists and ankles with duct tape. He gagged her. Then, for hours, he subjected her to unimaginable horror. He raped her. He tortured her. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. This was calculated cruelty against a woman who had done nothing more than end a relationship that made her unhappy. At 5:31, Clifford left the house briefly to go to the outbuilding. He took Louise's phone. Using it, he sent a message to John Hunt, asking when he would be home. He searched online to see if unplugging a smoke detector would fully disconnect it. Investigators believe he was planning to burn the house down with evidence inside. Clifford returned to the back garden, then re-entered the house at 6:20. He closed the patio blinds. He was preparing for the final act. At 6:49 in the evening, Hannah Hunt called her mother's phone. She was approaching the house, wondering why Carol hadn't answered. 1 minute later, at 6:50, Clifford shot Louise through the back with a crossbow bolt. Louise died almost instantly. Hannah entered the property mere seconds later. She called out to her mother, asking why she hadn't answered the phone. She went upstairs. Then she saw him, Kyle Clifford, standing in her family home. Hannah began shouting at him. He tried to calm her down, but Hannah started crying, screaming. At 6:52, Hannah managed to send a message to her boyfriend Alex Klein. The message said to call the police. It said Kyle Clifford was tying her up. Then her phone was silenced. At 6:54, Clifford shot Hannah with the crossbow. The bolt struck her, a terrible wound, but it didn't kill her immediately. Clifford fled the house, once again concealing the crossbow under a blanket. He walked away from Ashland Close. Based on audio recordings from the doorbell camera, investigators believe Hannah discovered the bodies of her mother and sister at 6:57. She was wounded, dying, surrounded by horror. But Hannah didn't give up. Police who would later investigate called Hannah's actions extraordinary. Officers with 30 years of experience said their breath was taken away by her bravery, by how clearly she was able to think in that moment of absolute terror. Hannah knew what she needed to do. Despite her injuries, despite the trauma, she called 999. She told emergency services what had happened. She identified Kyle Clifford as the killer. She gave police the information they needed. Then, Hannah managed to send another message to her boyfriend. She told him what had happened. She told him who was responsible. These actions would save her father's life. Investigators believe Clifford had planned to wait for John Hunt to return home and kill him too. But Hannah's call to emergency services changed everything. Police were on their way. Hannah Hunt died from her injuries before help could arrive. But her final moments were an act of incredible courage. Police arrived at the house on Ashland Close at 7 in the evening. They found Hannah in the main doorway, barely clinging to life. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Carol and Louise. All three women were pronounced dead at the scene. The weapons used, the method of killing, the sheer brutality of it, shocked even veteran officers. This was described as one of the most horrific crime scenes they had encountered. A neighbor's security camera had captured footage of a man leaving the Hunt home, carrying a large object under a white sheet. The figure got into a black seat vehicle. John Hunt was still at Lingfield Park, still working. Someone had to tell him. Imagine receiving that news. Your wife, your 2 daughters, all gone. Murdered in your own home while you were away doing your job. The devastation, John would later say, could not be put into words. Police immediately began searching for Kyle Clifford. His car was found abandoned. He was considered armed and dangerous, possibly still carrying the crossbow. The public was warned not to approach him. The search focused on the Enfield area, where Clifford lived. Officers raided his home. They searched his brother Bradley's former address. Hours passed with no sign of him. On the 10th of July, the day after the murders, police received reports of a person in Lavender Hill Cemetery in Enfield, about 15 miles from Bushy. Armed officers responded. Helicopters circled overhead. An air ambulance landed. They found Kyle Clifford in the cemetery. He had shot himself in the chest with the crossbow. The self-inflicted wound was severe. He was paralyzed from the chest down. Officers took him into custody, recovering the crossbow at the scene. No shots were fired by police. Clifford was taken to the hospital in critical condition. He remained under police guard, but his injuries were so severe that he couldn't be formally arrested until the 11th of July, when he was stable enough to understand the charges. The racing community rallied around John Hunt. At Newmarket's July Festival, jockeys wore black armbands. A minute of silence was held. Tributes poured in from colleagues, from people who had never met John, but felt connected to his grief. John Hunt released a statement with his daughter Amy. They said the devastation they were experiencing could not be put into words. They thanked people for their messages of support. They asked for privacy and time to grieve. A fundraising page was started to help the family. Thousands of pounds were raised. The British racing community, tight-knit and supportive, came together, but no amount of support could change what had happened. No words could bring Carol, Hannah, and Louise back. Kyle Clifford was charged with 3 counts of murder. He was charged with the false imprisonment of Louise Hunt, 2 counts of possessing offensive weapons, and later, he was charged with 1 count of rape. On the 17th of September, 2024, Clifford appeared remotely at Westminster Magistrates Court. In December, at Cambridge Crown Court, he pleaded not guilty to all charges. The case went to trial on the 3rd of March, 2025. As evidence was presented, the full horror of what Clifford had done became clear. The digital evidence showing his purchases after the breakup, the timeline showing his calculated approach, the doorbell camera recordings, Hannah's messages and 999 call. On the 22nd of January, 2025, Kyle Clifford changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder, guilty to false imprisonment, guilty to possession of offensive weapons, but he pleaded not guilty to the rape charge. That case went before a jury, who heard the evidence and found him guilty. On the 11th of March, 2025, Kyle Clifford was sentenced at Cambridge Crown Court. He refused to attend the hearing. This final act of cowardice meant he didn't face John Hunt and Amy in person. Judge Joel Benathan delivered the sentence in Clifford's absence. He described the murders as brutal and cowardly. He said the evidence showed Clifford to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. Letters Clifford had written to his family before the attacks were, the judge said, dripping with self-pity. The judge noted that Louise Hunt had been as gentle as she could in ending the relationship after Clifford's arrogance and anger proved too much for her to stand. Hannah Hunt had done nothing to harm Clifford except support her little sister, and Carol Hunt had shown Clifford nothing but kindness in the moments before he attacked her. Kyle Marcus Clifford was sentenced to a whole life order. He will never be released from prison. He will die behind bars, paralyzed, living with what he did. Almost a year after the murders, in June 2025, John Hunt gave his first television interview. He sat with his daughter Amy and spoke with BBC journalist Victoria Derbyshire. It was a moment of profound courage. John said that from the moment he wakes up, he says good morning to Carol, Hannah, and Louise. He talks to them every day. Sometimes he says out loud to Hannah and Louise that he's sorry he can't be with them because he's with their mom at that moment. As he closes his eyes at night, he chats with them. They are never far from him. John spoke about Hannah's final actions. He said he believes those actions saved his life. Police officers confirmed that Clifford had searched online for John's schedule, suggesting he planned to wait for the commentator to return home. But Hannah's 999 call brought police to the scene immediately. "I get to live," John said. "Hannah gave me that, and I've got to treat it as a gift from her. When John confronted Clifford in court through his victim impact statement, he wanted to look him in the eye. He told Clifford he was callous, cowardly, and vindictive. He said that hell would roll out the red carpet for what he had done. But John also reflected on how Clifford had deceived them all during his 18-month relationship with Louise. When I challenged myself about how you were able to deceive us all, John said, I simply say that you are a psychopath who, for the duration of your time together with Louise, was able to disguise yourself as an ordinary human being. Amy Hunt echoed this. She said they had absolutely no indication that this man was capable of stabbing their mother, tying Louise up, raping Louise, shooting Louise and shooting Hannah. The signs, she said, simply weren't there. John still lives in the family home. He returned to work as a racing commentator, first at Brighton in September 2024, chosen because it was the last place he and Carol had spent a weekend together. His colleagues wrapped their arms around him. Racing, his second family, held him up when he needed it most. The Hunt family murders forced a nation to confront uncomfortable questions about domestic violence, about the warning signs that sometimes aren't visible to those closest to the situation, about crossbow laws in the United Kingdom, where these weapons can be purchased without a license. There were calls for legislative change. The case drew comparisons to an incident in December 2021, when an intruder with a crossbow broke into Windsor Castle, intending to kill Queen Elizabeth II. That man, Jaswant Singh Chahal, was later sentenced to 9 years in prison for treason. But beyond policy debates, this case reminds us of something more fundamental. It reminds us that the people we love can be taken from us in an instant, that violence can hide behind a familiar face, that evil doesn't always announce itself. John Hunt's message to the world, shared through his friend Matt Chapman, was simple and profound. You never know when it's going to be the last day you see your family. Make the most of every day because you just don't know. Carol Hunt was 61 years old, a mother, a wife, the center of her family. She welcomed a young man into her home and showed him kindness. That kindness was repaid with violence. Hannah Hunt was 28 years old, a beautician who brought confidence to her clients. In her final moments, wounded and surrounded by horror, she thought not of herself but of protecting her father. Her actions saved his life. Louise Hunt was 25 years old, a dog groomer who loved animals and cared for them with tenderness. She had the courage to end a relationship that wasn't right for her. She deserved to live free from fear, free from violence. Instead, she became the victim of a man who couldn't accept that she had the right to say no. These 3 women died on the 9th of July, 2024, in their home in Bushey, Hertfordshire. They were murdered by Kyle Clifford, a man who claimed to care for one of them but proved capable only of destruction. Their memory lives on in John and Amy Hunt, in the racing community that embraced them, in the Hunt Family Fund, established to support charities and causes that help and inspire young women, in everyone who heard their story and promised to hold their loved ones a little closer. Let yourself rest now. The story is told. Justice, such as it is, has been served. Kyle Clifford will never walk free, but justice doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't erase the grief. What remains is memory, and love, and the precious, fragile nature of the lives we share with those we hold dear. Tonight I want you to sleep well, but tomorrow, tell the people you love that you love them. Don't wait. Don't assume there will always be time. Because as the Hunt family learned on that terrible summer day, time is never guaranteed. Please, if you haven't drifted off yet, check in with me. Tell me which story has been the most chilling so far, the first, the second, or the third. And if you're enjoying these stories, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, Let's move on to story number 4. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in Central Florida in early 2024. It's a case that speaks to the darkest corners of human nature, but also to the tireless work of investigators who refuse to let the truth remain hidden. In the warm days of late February 2024, in a quiet apartment complex in Kissimmee, Florida, a young girl named Madeline Soto was celebrating her 13th birthday. Friends and family knew her as Maddie, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed teenager who was just beginning to navigate the complicated waters of adolescence. Her birthday fell on February 22nd, and her family gathered to celebrate. There were smiles. There was cake. There was the promise of another year ahead. Maddie was a student at Hunters Creek Middle School in Orlando, just a short drive from the apartment she shared with her mother, Jennifer Soto, and her mother's boyfriend, a 37-year-old man named Stephen Stearns. The living arrangement was unconventional, to say the least. The apartment also housed another roommate, which meant space was at a premium. According to later accounts, the family had worked out a system where Jennifer, Maddie, and Stearns rotated between 2 bedrooms. Sometimes Jennifer would send Maddie and Stearns to sleep in the upstairs bedroom, while she took the primary room downstairs. Other times, all 3 would share the king-size bed together. It was an arrangement that Jennifer would later describe to investigators with a mixture of matter-of-fact acceptance and underlying discomfort. She admitted that she sent them upstairs when she needed a good night's sleep, though she also confessed to detectives that she had never felt entirely comfortable with Stearns sleeping in the same bed as her daughter. In one chilling statement, she told police she had always feared the relationship between Stearns and Maddie would become what she called a Woody Allen situation, a reference to the filmmaker's controversial marriage to his former girlfriend's adopted daughter. Still, life continued. The birthday celebration on the 25th was reportedly pleasant. There was no outward indication that anything terrible was about to unfold. The morning of Monday, February 26th began like many others in the Soto household, at least on the surface. Jennifer Soto would later tell investigators that she had asked Maddie and Stearns to sleep in the upstairs bedroom the night before because she wanted to get a good night's rest. Her new job had been exhausting her, and she needed the space to sleep alone. According to Jennifer's initial account to police, she woke around 7 or 8 in the morning to the sound of Stearns taking their dog for a walk. She said she didn't hear Maddie getting ready for school. No shower running, no footsteps, no sounds of a teenager preparing for her day. This should have struck her as unusual, but in the chaos of a Monday morning, Jennifer said she didn't think much of it. Stearns told everyone that he would take Maddie to school that morning. He claimed he dropped her off near Peace United Methodist Preschool, which was a few blocks away from Hunters Creek Middle School, around 8:40 in the morning. This detail seemed odd to investigators. School didn't start until 9:30, and why would he drop her at a preschool rather than the middle school itself? Stearns explained that Maddie had asked to be let out there so she could walk the rest of the way. Jennifer went about her day, assuming her daughter was safely at school. But when she arrived at Hunters Creek Middle School, around 4:30 that afternoon to pick Maddie up, school officials delivered devastating news. Maddie had never arrived at school that day. She hadn't been in first period. She hadn't been in second period. She hadn't been seen at all. Jennifer's world immediately began to unravel. She called Maddie's best friend, hoping for some explanation, some simple misunderstanding, but the friend confirmed it. Maddie hadn't come to school. Nobody had seen her. At approximately 8 o'clock that evening, Jennifer reported her daughter missing. The wheels of investigation began to turn. When Orange County Sheriff's deputies arrived to take the missing person report, They began asking the standard questions. When was Maddie last seen? What was she wearing? Who was the last person to see her? The answers led them directly to Stephen Stearns. Stearns seemed cooperative at first. He repeated his story about dropping Maddie off near the church several blocks from school. He said she had seemed fine, just sleepy. He claimed he had watched her walk away before he drove off. But investigators found several details of his story troubling. For one thing, nobody at the school had called to report Maddie's absence. This was a failure of the school's attendance system. But it also meant that precious hours had passed without anyone knowing something was wrong. As one school board member would later note, the first hour after a child goes missing is the most critical for recovery. Every hour after that, the chances diminish. Investigators began reviewing security footage from the apartment complex and surrounding areas. License plate readers, traffic cameras, surveillance systems, all were scrutinized, and what they found contradicted Stearns' story completely. At 7:30 in the morning on February 26, security cameras captured Stearns' vehicle pulling up to a dumpster at the Venetian Bay apartment complex. Stearns, wearing a red shirt and tan pants, was seen exiting the vehicle and throwing away 2 large white trash bags. The footage showed something else, something that made investigators' blood run cold. In the passenger seat of Stearns' vehicle was a figure wearing a green sweatshirt, the same green sweatshirt Maddie had been wearing, but the figure's positioning was all wrong. Her head was slumped over to the left in an unnatural angle. She didn't move when Stearns got out of the car. She didn't move when he got back in. The detectives who reviewed that footage came to a grim conclusion. Maddie was already dead. Further footage from 8:10 that morning showed Stearns driving south on John Young Parkway. The investigation revealed that he had made multiple trips that morning, leaving and returning to the apartment complex. License plate readers tracked his movements. He was heading toward a wooded area in Osceola County near the town of St. Cloud. When investigators searched the dumpster where Stearns had thrown those trash bags, they found Maddie's backpack with its distinctive Hawaiian print. Inside was her school-issued laptop. They also found a single white crock, the mate to one found in the bedroom where Maddie lived. Stearns had never taken Maddie to school. Instead, investigators believed he had spent the early morning hours disposing of evidence and moving her body. On February 27th, detectives brought Stearns in for questioning. He sat in an interrogation room for over 5 hours. For the first 3 hours he simply slept at the desk, his head down, seemingly unbothered by the fact that his girlfriend's daughter was missing. When residents finally began their questioning, Stearns maintained his story, though it began to shift in small ways. He told them he had stopped at a vape shop that morning, and that Maddie had been asleep in the passenger seat while he went inside. When pressed about her position, he said she had reclined the seat and was leaning back, just kind of conked out napping. The detectives asked for permission to search his cell phone. Stearns agreed, but with a caveat that immediately raised red flags. He said he had accidentally performed a factory reset on his phone on February 26, the very day Maddie went missing. He claimed he was trying to update it. The technical forensics team later discovered that the phone had actually been factory reset twice within a 12-hour period before it was turned over to police. The first reset occurred at 12:12 in the afternoon on February 26th. This was no accident. This was someone trying desperately to hide something. But Stearns had made a critical mistake. While the factory reset had erased data from the phone itself, it couldn't touch what was stored in the cloud. Investigators obtained access to Stearns' Google Drive account, and what they found there would transform the investigation from a missing person case into something far more sinister. The images and videos on Stearns' Google Drive told a horrifying story, one that had been unfolding for years, hidden in plain sight. There were more than 1,500 files, and they depicted Maddie in sexual situations. The abuse, investigators determined, had begun when she was just 8 years old. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. These were not images that could be explained away or misinterpreted. They were clear documentation of ongoing sexual abuse, carefully recorded and stored by Stearns himself. When confronted with this evidence, Jennifer Soto's world collapsed. Detectives sat her down and showed her the photos. Her reaction was complicated and would become a subject of intense scrutiny. According to police reports, her emotions appeared, in their assessment, somewhat fictitious. She cried, yes, but investigators noted that she seemed more protective of Stearns than concerned about her daughter. In one telling exchange, after being shown photographic evidence of Stearns abusing Maddie, Jennifer's first instinct was to ask if Stearns needed a lawyer. Detectives confronted her about this. They pointed out that she had just seen proof of her daughter being victimized, and her immediate thought was to protect her abuser. Jennifer would eventually tell investigators that she believed Stearns was guilty, but only after being shown the surveillance footage of Maddie slumped in his car. Even then, she made statements that troubled the investigators. She referred to the sexual abuse as the sex stuff, distinguishing it from the murder, which she called evil. The detectives noted that she didn't show the same level of emotion about the ongoing victimization as she did about the disappearance. In later interviews, Jennifer admitted she had been aware of Stearns grooming and abusing Maddie. Though she claimed she had been oblivious to the full extent, she called him a master liar and master manipulator, someone who had deceived her completely. She said she wanted to believe he was innocent, even as the evidence mounted against him. Investigators learned troubling details about the household dynamics. The roommate who lived with them told police she had never seen Stearns take Maddie to school before. The story about him being the one to drop her off that morning immediately seemed suspicious. The roommate also provided information about the strange sleeping arrangements and mentioned that the living situation often felt uncomfortable. Even more disturbing, investigators discovered that Stearns had been secretly filming the roommate as well. They found images on his phone taken with his cell phone, positioned under the bathroom door to capture the roommate nude. She had never given permission for these photos. It painted a picture of a man with a pattern of violating boundaries and documenting his violations. While all of this was unfolding, Stearns was supposedly helping search for Maddie. On the night of February 27th, he and Jennifer stayed at a hotel near Walt Disney World with Stearns' father. Jennifer would later tell police that Stearns was very panicky because he wanted his cell phone back from investigators. Both Jennifer and Stearns seemed convinced that police were targeting the wrong person. But during that night, Stearns did something that investigators found deeply suspicious. He slipped out of the hotel without telling anyone and drove all the way to Northport, nearly 2 hours away, where his parents lived. When his father later asked why he had made this trip, Stearns gave a vague answer. "I had wanted to grab a few things," Stearns said in a recorded phone call from jail, "and get my ducks in a row. Kinda prepare myself for whatever was coming. But I couldn't find what I was looking for." Investigators believed they knew exactly what he was looking for. They think he was attempting to log into his Google account using his parents' Wi-Fi to delete the incriminating images and videos. The attempts were unsuccessful. He couldn't remember his password, or perhaps Google security measures prevented him from accessing the account from a new location. During the same phone call with his father, the conversation took a chilling turn. Stearns' father said he wished he could understand how the whole situation came about. Stearns replied, simply, "Well, I didn't start it." His father pointed out that Stearns had participated in it. Stearns said, "Yeah." At no point during this conversation did Stearns deny murdering Maddie. On March 1st, after days of intensive searching, Deputies found Maddie's body in a wooded area off Hickory Tree Road in Osceola County. It was a remote location, surrounded by trees, far from any main roads, the kind of place where someone hoped a body might never be discovered. The medical examiner who responded to the scene immediately noted several telling details. The bottoms of Maddie's socks were clean, indicating she hadn't walked anywhere. She had been carried or transported to this location. The medical examiner also observed that a portion of Maddie's hyoid bone, a small bone in the neck, was not intact. This injury was consistent with strangulation. The official autopsy later confirmed it. Maddie had died from strangulation. Her death was classified as a homicide. Based on the timeline established by surveillance footage and witness statements, investigators believed she had been killed in the early morning hours of February 26th, likely while she slept or shortly after waking. That night, a vigil was held near Hunters Creek Middle School. Community members gathered to remember a young girl whose life had been stolen just days after her 13th birthday. They lit candles, they shared memories, they wept for a child they couldn't save. On February 28th, just 2 days after Maddie was reported missing, and before her body was even found, an arrest warrant was issued for Stephen Stearns. He was initially charged with sexual battery and possession of child sexual abuse material. He was taken into custody and held without bond. As the investigation continued, the charges multiplied. Eventually, Stearns would face 60 counts related to sexual crimes, 8 counts of capital sexual battery on a child under the age of 12, 5 counts of sexual battery on someone between the ages of 12 and 18, 7 counts of lewd or lascivious molestation, and 40 counts of unlawful possession of materials depicting sexual performance by a child, 10 or more images per count. Then, in April 2024, a grand jury indicted Stearns on a charge of first-degree premeditated murder. The evidence, prosecutors said, showed someone who had made calculated moves to dispose of Maddie's belongings and place her body in a remote wooded area before she was ever reported missing. The evidence shows an individual who was entrusted to keep Madeline safe, said Kissimmee Police Chief Betty Holland during a press conference. The betrayal was profound. This was someone who should have protected Maddie, and instead he had victimized her for years before finally taking her life. In June 2024, the state attorney's office announced they would seek the death penalty against Stearns. The factors supporting this decision included aggravated child abuse, the fact that Stearns was in a position of familial authority over Maddie, the heinous nature of the crime, and his prior charges. Stearns' defense attorney filed motions arguing that the death penalty violated the 5th, 6th, 8th, and 14th Amendments, that it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. They also attempted to have the evidence from Stearns' phone suppressed, arguing it had been unlawfully seized. Stearns claimed he had been under the influence of a prescription anxiety medication when he consented to the search and hadn't eaten all day. The motion argued that his consent was therefore not valid. For more than a year, the case worked its way through the legal system. Trial dates were set and continued. Defense attorneys filed dozens of motions. Prosecutors prepared their case, organizing the massive amount of evidence they had collected. Stearns' parents, interviewed by police, described their son as someone who had spent a lifetime lying to them. His mother called him a monster and accused Jennifer of knowing what was happening to Maddie for years. They expressed their disapproval of Stearns' relationship with Jennifer, citing drug use and mental illness on both sides. They painted a picture of a dysfunctional relationship where both parties would sleep all the time and bring each other down during episodes of mental illness. An ex-girlfriend of Stearns also came forward. She told detectives about their brief relationship in 2022. Even during that relationship, Stearns had refused to spend the night with her. His excuse? He insisted he had to stay at Jennifer's home because Maddie and her mother couldn't sleep without him there. In retrospect, investigators understood this differently. Stearns didn't want to spend nights away from his victim. A friend of Stearns also told police something revealing. During a conversation about his supposed breakup with Jennifer, Stearns had seemed more upset about the bond he created with Madeline than having a relationship with her mother. The focus, always, was on Maddie. Finally, on July 21, 2025, over 500 days after Maddie's body was found, the case reached its conclusion without a trial. In a plea agreement carefully coordinated with Maddie's family, Stearns pleaded no contest to first-degree premeditated murder. By pleading no contest, he did not admit guilt, but accepted that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He pleaded guilty to 8 counts of capital sexual battery of a child under 12, 5 counts of sexual battery of someone between 12 and 18, and 7 counts of lewd or lascivious molestation. In total, he was pleading guilty to 20 sexual abuse charges in addition to the murder charge. The sentencing hearing was held on the same day as the plea. Family members and loved ones filled the courtroom, many weeping openly as they prepared to address the court. These were the people whose lives had been shattered by Stearns' actions, people who would carry the weight of this tragedy forever. Maddie's father, Tyler Wallace, spoke through tears. He hadn't been as present in Maddie's life as he'd wanted to be, something he would now regret forever. Because of the actions of this depraved man, he told the court, his voice breaking, "I will never meet the woman she was becoming, and I can't grasp it." He looked directly at Stearns. "I can't grasp the selfishness of you, the deplorability of your actions. You're depraved, you're weak, you're a coward. It doesn't heal with time." Maddie's maternal grandmother, Yolanda Zambrano, had a statement read by a prosecutor. She described feeling like a second mother to Maddie, and said Stearns had left her with a broken soul. She spoke of how Stearns had betrayed everything about Maddie, her love, her trust, her innocence, her body. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he had taken her life, and with her he killed a piece of our souls. The courtroom heard from others who had known and loved Maddie. They spoke of a bright, joyful girl who had her whole life ahead of her. They spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, milestones that would never be reached, dreams that would never be fulfilled. State Attorney Monique Worrell addressed the court, emphasizing that Maddie's life was stolen in a senseless act of violence. The plea deal, she explained, meant that Stearns waived any right to appeal. He would never have another opportunity to challenge his conviction or sentence. The judge, having heard the anger and fury of shattered families and a grieving community, imposed his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge. Additionally, Stearns received 20 more life sentences for the sexual abuse charges, 21 life sentences in total, all to run concurrently. There would be no possibility of parole, no second chances. Stephen Stearns, at 39 years old, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As the case concluded, one question lingered in many minds. What about Jennifer Soto? She had sent her daughter to sleep in the same bed as Stearns on the night before Maddie's death. She had admitted to having concerns about their relationship, to fearing a Woody Allen situation. She had allowed this living arrangement to continue despite her discomfort. Investigators had noted her contradictory statements, her apparent protection of Stearns even after seeing evidence of abuse, her reaction to the discovery of the sexual abuse material. Some witnesses, including Stearns' own mother, accused her of knowing about the abuse for years, yet Jennifer was never charged with any crime. The investigation focused squarely on Stearns as the perpetrator. Whether prosecutors found insufficient evidence to charge her, or whether other considerations played a role, remains unclear. She did not attend Stern's sentencing hearing. The case raises uncomfortable questions about how abuse can continue hidden in plain sight, about the signs that might have been missed or ignored, about the systems that failed to protect a vulnerable child. Maddie's school never called to report her absence that crucial day. The living arrangements in the household went unchallenged. The signs were there, perhaps, but nobody connected the dots until it was too late. Maddie Soto was 13 years old. She had just celebrated her birthday. She should have had decades ahead of her: high school graduations, first loves, career ambitions, perhaps children of her own someday. Instead, her life ended in the early morning darkness of a February morning in Florida, at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect her. Her story is one of betrayal at the deepest level, of innocence stolen, of a childhood that became a nightmare. But it's also a story of investigators who refused to accept simple explanations, who followed the evidence wherever it led, who built a case so overwhelming that even the perpetrator eventually had no choice but to accept responsibility. The case of Madeline Soto is closed now. Stephen Stearns will never leave prison, but for those who loved Maddie, her father, her grandmother, her friends, her community, the pain continues. They carry forward her memory, ensuring that even though her life was cut tragically short, she will not be forgotten. And perhaps in sharing her story, we honor her memory in another way. By remaining vigilant, by questioning situations that don't feel right, by protecting the vulnerable among us, by refusing to look away when something seems wrong. Rest easy tonight. Maddie's story has been told. Justice, in whatever limited form it can take, has been served. And while the darkness of this case is profound, we can find some small comfort in knowing that the truth emerged, that the perpetrator was held accountable, and that Maddie is at peace. If you're still awake and listening, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the beautiful Santa Monica Mountains of California, where nature's tranquility was shattered by an unexpected tragedy. This is the story of Tristan Baudet, a devoted father, a brilliant scientist, and a man who loved the outdoors. Let me guide you through this case, slowly, carefully, with respect for those involved. This story begins not with violence, but with promise. Tristan Thomas Baudet was born and raised in Fresno, California, where the summer heat stretched long across the Central Valley. He was the kind of student that teachers remembered fondly, the kind who excelled not through arrogance but through genuine curiosity and dedication. In the year 2000, he graduated as valedictorian from Edison High School, achievement that surprised no one who knew his work ethic and his kind nature. From Fresno, Tristan journeyed south to the University of California, San Diego, where he immersed himself in the study of chemistry. The Pacific Ocean was nearby, the campus alive with intellectual energy, and Tristan thrived. He graduated in 2005 with his bachelor's degree, but his thirst for knowledge was far from satisfied. That same year, he enrolled at UC Berkeley to pursue his doctorate in chemistry. Berkeley, with its reputation for rigorous academic standards and groundbreaking research, would become Tristan's home for the next 5 years. His doctoral work focused on something remarkably specific and important: the synthesis and biological evaluation of acid-degradable polymeric materials for protein-based vaccines. In simpler terms, Tristan was working on ways to make vaccines safer and more effective, developing new delivery systems that could revolutionize how we protect ourselves from disease. He wasn't working alone in a laboratory, isolated from the world. Tristan led multidisciplinary teams, bringing together chemists, immunologists, and biologists. He synthesized complex microparticles and tested their ability to trigger immune responses. He developed methods for targeted drug and gene delivery. He presented his findings at national conferences and published his work in peer-reviewed journals. By 2010, when he completed his PhD, Tristan Baudet had already made meaningful contributions to pharmaceutical science. But Tristan was more than his resume. Friends remembered him as genuinely kind, the sort of person who made everyone feel welcome. He loved the outdoors with a passion that never dimmed, hiking through mountain trails, biking along coastal paths, snowboarding down powdery slopes, camping under star-filled skies. These weren't just hobbies for Tristan. They were essential parts of who he was. After completing his doctorate, Tristan moved to Irvine, a planned city in Orange County where palm trees lined orderly streets and the pharmaceutical industry thrived. He joined Allergan, an Irish pharmaceutical company with significant operations in California. Starting as a postdoctoral fellow in 2010, Tristan focused on drug delivery systems, applying his academic research to real-world medical applications. Over the years, Tristan climbed steadily through the ranks at Allergan. By 2015, he'd been promoted to senior scientist. His work centered on formulation and manufacturing processes for sustained-release combination products, complex pharmaceutical preparations that released medication gradually over time. By March of 2018, just months before his death, Tristan had been named an associate director, a recognition of his expertise and leadership. But even more important than his career was his family. Tristan had met his wife Erica Wu when they were teenagers. They grew up together, their relationship deepening from young friendship into mature love. Erica became a physician and obstetrician who brought new life into the world while Tristan worked to extend and improve that life through pharmaceutical innovation. Together they had 2 daughters. By June of 2018, their girls were 4 years old and 2 years old, at those precious ages when everything is wonder and discovery. Tristan was, by all accounts, a devoted father. His selfless devotion to his children came naturally. He found joy in every aspect of fatherhood, from bedtime stories to outdoor adventures. The family was on the cusp of change. Tristan had recently decided to leave Allergan and accept a new position in the Bay Area, north of Irvine. It was a move that promised new opportunities, a new chapter for the family. Before the transition, before the chaos of moving and starting new jobs, Tristan and Erica planned to take some time off together. They wanted to savor these moments as a family, to breathe and simply be together before life accelerated again. Erica had an important exam to study for, a crucial step in her medical career. So Tristan made a decision. He would take their 2 daughters camping, giving Erica quiet time to prepare, while he and the girls enjoyed nature together. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture that defined Tristan's character. He chose Malibu Creek State Park. Malibu Creek State Park spans more than 8,000 acres in the Santa Monica Mountains, roughly 30 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles. The park had a storied history. The land had been home to the Chumash people for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. In the early 1900s, wealthy businessmen from Los Angeles formed the Crags Country Club there, building a dam to create Century Lake. By the 1940s, 20th Century Fox purchased the property to use as a movie ranch, a place where crews could film scenes requiring natural settings without traveling far from Hollywood. Over the decades, the land became the backdrop for countless productions. The television series MASH was filmed there. Planet of the Apes scenes were shot on those volcanic rock formations. Parts of the land had even been owned by Bob Hope and Ronald Reagan before being sold to the state. California purchased the property in 1974, and opened Malibu Creek State Park to the public in 1976. It quickly became a beloved destination. The park offered 35 miles of trails winding through oak woodlands and chaparral-covered slopes. Century Lake glimmered in the sunlight. The rock pool invited swimmers on hot days. Wildlife thrived. Mountain lions, bobcats, mule deer, golden eagles, and countless bird species made their homes in those canyons and meadows. For someone like Tristan Baudet, who was happiest in nature, the park represented everything he loved about California's outdoors. It was close enough to Irvine for a weekend trip, but remote enough to feel like an escape from urban sprawl. But by the summer of 2018, Malibu Creek State Park harbored a dark secret that few members of the public knew about. Someone had been shooting at people there for nearly 2 years. The pattern began in November of 2016. A man sleeping in a hammock at the park was shot and wounded. Less than a week later, someone fired into the sleeping area of a vehicle. Then, in January of 2017, another shooting occurred at the campground. Throughout 2017, the shootings continued. Vehicles were hit by gunfire on 3 separate occasions. Miraculously, no one in those vehicles was injured, but the incidents were terrifying. Drivers would hear sudden cracks, see damage to their cars, and realize they'd been targeted. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was aware of these incidents. Lieutenant James Royal, stationed at Lost Hills, the local sheriff's station, grew increasingly concerned about the pattern. He urged his superiors to warn the public about the ongoing shootings. The public had a right to know that visiting Malibu Creek State Park might put them in danger, but the warnings never came. Sheriff's Department officials, for reasons that would later become the subject of lawsuits and investigations, decided not to alert the public to the series of shootings. Perhaps they worried about causing panic, perhaps they believed the incidents were unconnected, perhaps they thought warning people would damage the park's reputation and tourism. Whatever their reasoning, they kept quiet. Lieutenant Royal's warnings fell on deaf ears. He was told that no public warning would be issued. Later, he would claim that he was punished for his persistence, retaliated against by department brass for trying to do what he believed was right. He would file a lawsuit alleging that the department's silence had dire consequences because the shootings didn't stop. On June 18, 2018, just 4 days before Tristan Baudet arrived at the park, someone shot at a white Tesla driving along Las Vershines Road near the park entrance. The bullet damaged the vehicle, but didn't injure the driver. It was another close call, another random act of violence in the pre-dawn hours when few witnesses would be awake. And still, the public knew nothing. Friday, June 22, 2018, began like any peaceful camping morning should. The sun had not yet risen. The air was cool and still. The campground at Malibu Creek State Park was quiet, except for the sounds of nature. Birds beginning their dawn chorus, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, perhaps the distant murmur of the creek. Tristan Baudet lay sleeping in his tent alongside his 2 young daughters. His 4-year-old and 2-year-old girls were nestled close to their father, safe and warm. Nearby, in another tent, was Tristan's brother-in-law, Scott McCurdy, who had joined them for the camping trip with his own 2 children. It was meant to be a simple, joyful family outing. The tents were fairly new. Children's bikes were parked near the vehicles. Toys were scattered about in that comfortable chaos that marks any family campsite. Everything spoke of normal family life, of fathers spending quality time with their kids, of childhood memories being made. Then, around 4:44 in the morning, when darkness still held sway and most campers were in their deepest sleep, shots rang out. Scott McCurdy jerked awake to loud popping sounds. At first, his mind tried to make sense of the noise. Were they fireworks? Something from a nearby fire pit? He saw what he later described as a flash of light. 5 shots total, he thought, though in the confusion of being suddenly woken, he couldn't be certain. At a nearby campsite, Stacy Seborn was also startled awake by the gunfire. The sounds were unmistakable to her, like shots from a shotgun or rifle. She felt a spike of fear. Where was the shooter? Was she in danger? She reached for her phone and called 911, speaking quietly because she didn't know if the person firing shots could hear her or see her tent. Scott heard one of Tristan's daughters begin to cry. He waited, expecting Tristan to comfort the child as any father would. But the crying continued. Then he heard the older sister talking with her younger sibling. Still, Tristan didn't respond. The younger daughter kept saying something. Wet, wet, Scott heard her repeat. At first he didn't think much of it. Maybe she'd had an accident, or spilled water. But the distress in the children's voices grew. The crying became more insistent. Scott got out of his tent and approached Tristan's tent. What he saw would haunt him forever. The 2 little girls were kneeling beside their father. They were trying to wake him up, calling for Daddy. Daddy, 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 the older girl cried, her voice carrying that mournful, desperate quality that only a child's grief can produce. The younger daughter's leggings were covered in blood, her father's blood, from kneeling next to him. Scott called out to his brother-in-law, but got no response. He held on to the girls, trying to comfort them, his own mind struggling to process what was happening. Other campers began to emerge, drawn by the commotion. Once Scott had help with the children, he went back into the tent to check on Tristan. He noticed a small hole in the tent's fabric. Then he looked at Tristan's face. I noticed there was nothing in his eyes. Scott would later testify in court. In that moment he understood. I realized he was gone and I left. A single bullet from a high-powered rifle had pierced the tent and struck Tristan Baudet in the head as he slept. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. He never woke. He never knew what happened. His 2 daughters, sleeping beside him, were physically unharmed but would carry the trauma of that morning for the rest of their lives. By the time sheriff's deputies arrived, there was nothing to be done. Tristan Baudet, 35 years old, a talented scientist, a devoted husband and father, a man who loved nature and lived with kindness, was dead. The murder sent shockwaves through the community. A man camping with his young children, shot in his sleep for no apparent reason. It seemed incomprehensible. News of Tristan's death spread quickly, and with it came the revelation that authorities had known about previous shootings in the area, but had never warned the public. People were outraged. Why hadn't they been told? How many families had camped at Malibu Creek State Park in the preceding months, completely unaware that someone had been taking shots at people? The park was shut down immediately after Tristan's murder. It would remain closed to camping for nearly a year. Erica Wu, Tristan's widow, was left to grapple with unimaginable loss. She released a statement describing Tristan as a devoted husband and father whose life revolved around his family. We met when we were teenagers, grew up together, married and had 2 amazing and beautiful daughters, she said. In everything that he did, Tristan was kind, selfless and giving, had a natural ability to connect with just about anyone. A GoFundMe account established to support Erica and the girls raised over $100,000 as the community rallied around the grieving family. But grief demanded answers. Who had done this, and why? The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department now faced immense pressure to solve the case. They publicly acknowledged that there had been at least 7 other unsolved shootings in the area dating back to November of 2016. Suddenly, what had seemed like isolated incidents took on a more sinister pattern. Investigators began working the case intensively. They looked at ballistics evidence. They examined the bullet that had killed Tristan. They revisited all the previous shooting incidents. looking for connections. They analyzed forensic evidence from the campsite. They followed up on tips from the public, and they began to develop a theory. The shooter wasn't someone targeting specific individuals. This wasn't about Tristan Baudet personally. The attacks appeared random, which in some ways made them even more terrifying. Someone was stalking the park and its surroundings, shooting at people for no apparent reason. The profile that emerged was of someone who lived in or near the park, someone comfortable in the wilderness, someone who moved through the mountains like a ghost. The attacks typically occurred in the pre-dawn hours when darkness provided cover and victims were most vulnerable, deep in sleep. Throughout the summer of 2018, as investigators worked the case, other crimes began occurring in the area. Commercial burglaries at local facilities, the Calabasas Community Center, broken into twice, the Las Virgenes Water District, also targeted twice. The pattern in these burglaries was unusual. Food was the primary target. Vending machines were smashed open, supplies taken. Whoever was responsible seemed to be living off stolen provisions. Then, in October of 2018, nearly 4 months after Tristan's murder, authorities spotted someone suspicious on a ridge top near the park. The man was carrying a backpack. When deputies approached and eventually detained him, they made several crucial discoveries. The man had a rifle in his backpack. He also had 2 loaded magazines and ammunition. His boots matched prints found at some of the burglary scenes. A scent dog was able to track his path back to a makeshift encampment in a ravine about 1.5 miles north of Mulholland Highway, west of Las Virgenes Road in the Malibu Canyon area. The man's name was Anthony Rada. He was 42 years old, and according to authorities, he was a survivalist who had been living in the Santa Monica Mountains, often sleeping outside, sustaining himself through burglaries and stolen food. Anthony Rada was not an unknown quantity to law enforcement. He had a criminal history that included previous time in state prison for possessing explosives and for possessing a loaded gun, which was illegal for someone with felony convictions. At the time of his arrest in October 2018, he was on probation. Rada's arrest in connection with the burglaries was just the beginning. As investigators examined the rifle found in his possession, they conducted ballistics testing. The results were damning. The weapon matched the bullet that had killed Tristan Baudet. It also matched a shooting that damaged the white Tesla 4 days before Tristan's murder. By January of 2019, prosecutors felt they had enough evidence. A grand jury was convened, and in November of 2019, Anthony Rada was formally indicted on an extensive list of charges: 1 count of murder for killing Tristan Baudet, 10 counts of attempted murder for the various shooting incidents, and 5 counts of second-degree commercial burglary for the break-ins at local facilities. The attempted murder charges included counts for Tristan's 2 daughters, who prosecutors argued had been placed in mortal danger even though they hadn't been physically harmed. The other attempted murder charges related to previous shooting victims, including the man wounded while sleeping in a hammock in November 2016, and various motorists whose vehicles had been shot at. But building a case and proving it in court are 2 different challenges. Rada pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense attorney would argue that the evidence against his client was weak, circumstantial, full of gaps. The case was delayed multiple times. Rada proved to be a difficult defendant. He attacked sheriff's deputies while in custody on at least 2 occasions, requiring him to be restrained during court appearances. By the time his trial finally began in May of 2023, nearly 5 years after Tristan's death, Rada had waived his right to be present in the courtroom. He refused to attend his own trial. The trial opened on Friday, May 5, 2023, in downtown Los Angeles. For Erica Wu, now raising her daughters alone for nearly 5 years, it was a chance to finally see some form of justice for Tristan. She attended the proceedings with a large support group, knowing she would have to relive the trauma of that morning. Deputy District Attorney Antonella Nestorescu laid out the prosecution's case. The evidence, she told the jury, was overwhelming. Prosecutors traced Rada's movements through digital and physical evidence. His phone had connected to the park's Wi-Fi network regularly. Bootprints found at crime scenes matched his boots. The rifle in his possession when arrested was ballistically linked to Tristan's murder and the Tesla shooting. Nestorescu painted a picture of a deliberate predator. The evidence shows a pattern of stalking and preying on campers. She told the jury, Rada had terrorized the area since November 2016. The victims were shot during the pre-dawn hours, a time when people are usually in their deepest, most peaceful sleep. He wore a mask and dark clothing, moved carefully and deliberately, always carrying his rifle. When Rada committed the burglaries after Tristan's murder, he was thorough and careful, the prosecutor said. Security footage from one business appeared to show him carrying a rifle, similar to the one found during his arrest. After the last break-in, investigators tracked him through the wilderness using bootprints and a scent dog, until they found his encampment. The defendant managed to do what he had persistently tried to do since 2016, when he killed Bodette. Nestorescu told the jury, Tristan was sleeping next to his daughters when he was shot. His youngest daughter's leggings were covered in her father's blood when she knelt beside him. The testimony was devastating. Stacy Seburn, who had camped nearby, described being awakened by gunshots and hearing a man calling for help and a baby crying. It was a very mournful cry for Daddy over and over again, she testified. Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. Scott McCurdy recounted checking on his brother-in-law and seeing nothing in Tristan's eyes, realizing he was gone. He described the small hole in the tent, the toys scattered around the campsite, the children's bike on top of one of the vehicles, all the small details that spoke of interrupted innocence. But Rada's defense attorney, Nicholas Okorocha, pushed back against the prosecution's narrative. He urged jurors to look for reasonable doubt, to watch for the absence of evidence that would indicate gaps in the case. One piece of evidence that the defense highlighted was DNA testing performed on cigarette butts found near where authorities believed the shooter had positioned himself. The DNA from those cigarette butts came from an unidentified male and did not match Anthony Rada. The defense argued this proved someone else had been at the scene. The investigation had been going on for 4.5 years. Okorocha noted, and authorities still couldn't identify whose DNA was on those cigarette butts. In her rebuttal, Nestorescu dismissed the cigarette butt discussion as a red herring. They were found in a public campground, she pointed out. Anyone could have discarded them there at any time, completely unrelated to the shooting. The defense also questioned whether Rada's phone being connected to the park's Wi-Fi proved he was physically present at specific times. Many people connected to that Wi-Fi, the defense argued. Regular connection didn't equal presence during the crimes. But the prosecution had more than circumstantial evidence. They had ballistics, they had the rifle, they had the pattern of behavior. They had Rada living in the mountains, stealing food, moving through the area like someone intimately familiar with the terrain. After hearing all the evidence and arguments, the jury began deliberations on Tuesday, May 23, 2023. On Friday, May 26, 2023, the jury returned with their verdict. Erica Wu sat in the courtroom, surrounded by family and friends, bracing herself for whatever was to come. The jury found Anthony Rada guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Tristan Bodette. It wasn't the first-degree murder conviction that prosecutors had sought, which would have required proof of premeditation and deliberation. But it was murder nonetheless, a conviction that recognized Rada had intentionally and unlawfully killed Tristan. The jury also convicted Rada of 3 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts for Tristan's daughters, who had been sleeping beside him and whom the jury determined had been placed in mortal danger, and 1 count for shooting at the Tesla driver 4 days before Tristan's death. Notably, however, the jury ruled that Rada had not acted willfully to kill the daughters or with premeditation regarding them. He was acquitted of 7 other attempted murder charges related to the earlier shooting incidents. Perhaps the jury felt the evidence linking Rada to those specific incidents wasn't strong enough, despite the pattern they suggested. We'll never know their exact reasoning, as jury deliberations are confidential. But the jury did find Rada guilty on all 5 counts of second-degree commercial burglary, the break-ins at the Calabasas Community Center and the Las Virgenes Water District. As the verdicts were read, Erica Wu wept. 5 years of waiting, of raising 2 daughters who would never fully remember their father, of dealing with trauma and loss and the slow grind of the justice system, had led to this moment. Rada himself was not in the courtroom to hear the verdicts. He had waived his right to be present, and so the words were spoken in his absence. Sentencing was scheduled for June 7, 2023. This time, Anthony Rada was present, though not by choice and not in a conventional manner. He was wheeled into the downtown Los Angeles courtroom in a restraining chair, wearing glasses and a black mesh spit hood over his head to prevent him from spitting on court personnel or deputies. His history of violence while in custody had led to these extraordinary security measures. Judge Eleanor J. Hunter, who had presided over the trial, addressed the courtroom. She called the case chilling. Anthony Rada, she said, was not only cold-blooded but also smart, a dangerous combination. She called him the poster boy for posing a danger to the community. Initially, Judge Hunter announced a sentence of 142 years to life in prison, but after meeting with attorneys, she reconvened the hearing and acknowledged she had made an error in calculating the sentence. The corrected sentence was 119 years to life. Let that sink in for a moment. 119 years to life. 40 years to life for the murder of Tristan Baudet, an additional 79 years to life for the burglaries and attempted murders. At 46 years old, Anthony Rada would almost certainly spend the remainder of his life behind bars. During the sentencing, the prosecution and defense presented their arguments. Nistorescu reminded the court of the terror Rada had inflicted on the community, the randomness of his attacks, the fact that he had managed to kill after nearly 2 years of trying. She spoke of the youngest daughter's leggings covered in her father's blood, of the mournful cries of children who didn't understand why daddy wouldn't wake up. Rada's attorney, Nicholas Alcarocha, declined to comment extensively on the sentencing, but said he appreciated the deeply moving victim impact statement delivered by Erica Wu. What she said in that statement wasn't reported in detail by the media, preserving some privacy for her grief. But one can imagine a widow speaking about a man she'd known since they were teenagers, a father who would never see his daughters grow up, a scientist whose potential contributions to the world were stolen by a random act of violence. The sentencing didn't end all legal matters related to the case. Erica Wu had filed a lawsuit against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, California State Parks, and other agencies, seeking at least $90 million in damages. Her claims centered on the allegation that these agencies had negligently failed to warn the public about the shootings, that they had known about at least 7 unsolved shootings in Malibu Creek State Park, but kept that information from the people who visited. Lieutenant James Royal's lawsuit against the county also proceeded, claiming he had been retaliated against for trying to warn the public, and that the department's silence had allowed further harm to occur. These civil cases spoke to larger questions about institutional responsibility, about what authorities owe to the public when they know about ongoing dangers. Should the park have been closed earlier? Should visitors have been warned? Would Tristan Baudet still be alive if people had known there was a pattern of random shootings in the area? We can never know the answer to that last question. Perhaps Tristan would have chosen to camp elsewhere. Perhaps he would have decided the risk was worth it for the experience he wanted to give his daughters. Perhaps the warnings would have prompted increased law enforcement presence that might have prevented the shooting. What we do know is that Tristan Baudet went camping on June 22, 2018, without any knowledge that he was putting himself and his children in danger. That information was withheld from him and from every other person who visited the park during those months when the shootings were occurring. Malibu Creek State Park eventually reopened to campers in May of 2019, nearly a year after Tristan's murder. Life, as it always does, continued. People returned to hike the trails, to wade in the rock pool, to photograph the volcanic rock formations. The MASH site remained a popular destination. The beauty of the Santa Monica Mountains persisted, indifferent to human tragedy. But for Tristan's family, life could never return to what it was. His daughters, who were now growing up without him, would only have fragments of memory from when they were 2 and 4 years old. Photographs would have to stand in for the father they'd lost. Stories from family members would have to fill in the gaps of who he was. Erica Wu continued her work as a physician, raising her daughters as a single mother, carrying grief that would never fully heal. The scientific community lost a researcher who might have made further breakthroughs in drug delivery systems, in vaccine technology, in pharmaceutical development. We'll never know what Tristan Baudet might have accomplished with a full life. His friends remembered him as the greatest friend you could ask for, a talented scientist, an amazing father to his beautiful daughters, and a devoted, loving husband. They remembered his genuine kindness, his natural ability to connect with people. They treasured the memories of annual hiking trips, of beers shared, of conversations about science and life and everything in between. The case of Anthony Rada and the murder of Tristan Baudet raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond one man's actions. How do we balance public safety with not wanting to cause panic? When authorities know about a pattern of dangerous incidents, what is their obligation to warn people? How do we prevent random violence when the perpetrator blends into the landscape, living off the grid, moving through wilderness areas that span thousands of acres? There are no easy answers. Rada was described as a survivalist, someone who chose to live outside of conventional society. He sustained himself through theft, moved through the mountains with apparent expertise, and for nearly 2 years managed to evade capture despite multiple shooting incidents. Even after he killed Tristan Baudet, it took investigators 4 more months to arrest him, and only then because his pattern of burglaries eventually led them to his encampment. The prosecution argued that Rada had a pattern of stalking and preying on campers, that he had persistently tried to kill someone since November 2016, and finally succeeded in June 2018. Whether he had a specific motive beyond the act itself remains unclear. Mental illness, anger at society, the isolation of living alone in the wilderness for extended periods, any or all of these factors might have played a role. But Rada never testified. He chose not to be present for most of his trial. His internal reasoning remains largely a mystery. What is not a mystery is the impact of his actions. A man is dead. 2 children grew up without their father. A wife lost her husband. Parents lost their son. The community lost a talented scientist and kind person. And beyond this one family, countless other people who visited Malibu Creek State Park during those months were unknowingly put at risk. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps we can take a moment to remember Tristan Baudet, not as a victim, but as he lived. Picture a young man who worked hard enough to become valedictorian, who pursued knowledge not for ego but because he genuinely wanted to make the world better. Imagine him in a laboratory at Berkeley, collaborating with immunologists and biologists, all of them working together to develop safer vaccines, to find better ways to deliver life-saving medications. Envision him as a father, teaching his daughters to ride bikes, reading them bedtime stories, making them laugh, showing them through his actions what kindness and devotion look like. Think of him with Erica, the woman he'd known since they were teenagers, building a life together, supporting each other's careers, creating a family filled with love. This is how Tristan Baudet should be remembered. Not for how he died, but for how he lived. With dedication, with kindness, with love, with an appreciation for both the complexities of science and the simple beauty of nature. As a devoted husband and father, as a talented scientist, as a good friend, as a good man. His death was a tragedy that should never have happened. The failure to warn the public about the pattern of shootings was a systemic failure with devastating consequences. But Tristan's life, the 35 years he spent on this earth, had meaning and value that transcends the circumstances of his death. He contributed to pharmaceutical science. He loved his family deeply. He was kind to the people around him. He sought out beauty in the natural world. These things matter. These things last beyond physical death. And so, as you close your eyes and let sleep come, hold on to that thought. Life is precious and fragile. We never know which moment might be our last. What matters is how we spend the time we're given. Do we work towards something meaningful? Do we treat others with kindness? Do we make time for the people we love? Do we appreciate the beauty around us? Tristan Baudet did all of these things. In that way, his life was a success, even though it was cut tragically short. Let this story settle in your mind. Tomorrow will come with its own concerns and joys. But for tonight, simply breathe. Remember that even in the darkest stories, there is light in the lives people live, and the love they share. Thank you so much for spending your night with Midnight Crime Stories. I hope the stories kept you company and helped you drift a little closer to sleep. If you're still awake, leave a final comment. Tell me which story stood out to you the most tonight. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calm, late-night true crime. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.